My name is Nora Tatum, and I am 38 years old, and the story I need to tell you begins in a church parking lot in Carmel, Indiana, on a Saturday in October, where I sat in my car for 14 minutes before I could make myself go inside, with a 4-month-old asleep in the back seat and a manila envelope in my lap and a blue rubber band around that envelope, and 7 receipts inside it that added up to $5,050. And I want to tell you about the priest who walked into that parish hall 2 hours later and opened a leather ledger and asked, in the most pleasant voice you have ever heard, if someone could please point him toward N. Tatum. And I want you to see my father-in-law's face in the moment those 2 words left Father Brennan's mouth, because Desmond Calloway had been looking at those 2 words on his son's bank statements for 3 years. On every automatic payment confirmation that crossed the kitchen counter, on every vendor invoice that arrived at our house, and he had never once, not once, stopped to ask who N. Tatum actually was. Before I keep going, if you're new here, please subscribe and hit the bell. It genuinely means more than I can tell you. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are, because I love knowing you're out there with me tonight. And then let me take you back to where this all started. I grew up in Terre Haute, Indiana, the youngest of 4 kids in a house where we did not talk about money the way some families don't talk about illness, because naming it made it more real. And my father was a union pipe fitter who came home every night smelling like solder and copper shavings. And my mother worked the counter at a dry cleaning shop on Main Street for 19 years. The same shop, the same counter, the same regulars who brought in their church clothes every Saturday morning. And they both came from families who handled hardship by not saying the word out loud. And so I learned early that money is not something you talk about. It is something you track. And I have been tracking it since I was 9 years old, which is how old I was when I found a gas disconnection notice tucked behind the kitchen clock and did not tell my parents. And instead babysat every single weekend for 6 weeks until I had $84, which was the exact amount on the notice. And I mailed it in myself through the post office 2 blocks from our house and put the confirmation slip back behind the clock. And I do not know if my mother ever found it, and I never asked. And what I understand now is that the girl who did that thing at 9 years old was the same woman who would one day put 7 receipts in a manila envelope and sit in a parking lot in October, knowing exactly what was inside. I put myself through Indiana State University on Pell Grants and a part-time bookkeeping job at a veterinary clinic in Terre Haute. And I was good at the bookkeeping. Good enough that when I moved to Carmel in my late 20s, I was hired at Whitmore Veterinary Group as their practice manager. And eventually, I managed all 3 of their locations: payroll, quarterly taxes, vendor contracts, facility maintenance, staffing, insurance negotiations. 11 years, no missed deadlines, no missed decimals. And I am telling you this because this story is about a man who looked at me for 3 years and decided he didn't need to see me clearly. And I need you to understand exactly what he was choosing not to look at. I met Connor Calloway at an animal shelter fundraiser in Indianapolis in 2013. And he was tall and easy in social situations in the particular way of people who grew up in houses where the financial questions were already answered before anyone asked them. And he was kind, genuinely, consistently kind. And we married in 2015, and I made the down payment on our house in Carmel from $38,000 I had saved over 9 years of living small and tracking everything. And when we set up our joint finances, I registered everything under my professional name, N. Tatum, because I had been N. Tatum on every account and contract since my first bookkeeping job at 22, and it seemed wildly inefficient to redo all that paperwork at once. And Connor said it didn't matter. And I said I'd get around to changing it. And I never did. And every automatic payment, every vendor invoice, every check, every church donation. N. Tatum. Not Calloway. Not ever Calloway. And I need you to hold that detail right now like something you found in a coat pocket, because it is the thing this whole story turns on. If you've ever been the person who keeps everything running and still somehow doesn't quite get a seat at the table, subscribe right now and share this, because I see you, and we are just getting started. Desmond Calloway is 68 years old, silver-haired, broad in the shoulders, with the posture of a man who was once physically commanding and is now performing the memory of it. And he chairs the parish council at St. Augustine's Catholic Church in Carmel. And he calls Connor every Sunday without fail. And in those Sunday calls, sometimes with me standing 3 feet away in our own kitchen, he refers to me as Connor's wife, not Nora, not even my first name, just Connor's wife, as though I am a function rather than a person, a placeholder for whoever a real Calloway daughter-in-law would be. And I have 3 years of evidence that he is not deliberately cruel, which is the thing I have had to hold on to most carefully, because it would be so much cleaner if he were. But he is simply a man who decided a long time ago what the Calloway family is and where its edges are. And he decided those edges in a room I was not in, and he has never seen any reason to revisit them. When Lily was born in June, 4 pounds 11 ounces, Connor's eyes, my mother's ears, the most important thing that has ever happened to me. Desmond called Connor from the hospital waiting room and did not call me. And he called the parish the next morning. And by February, he had begun coordinating the christening at St. Augustine's. And he used that verb in his Sunday call. Began coordinating. As in, we've begun coordinating the christening. As in, it is already in motion. As in, no one has asked your opinion, and no one is going to. And the group texts about catering vendors and Father Brennan's calendar and the date and the guest list went to Connor's phone, and not to mine. And I watched all of it happen the way I watch everything, completely and quietly, and with both hands in my lap. The planning meeting was on a Tuesday in March, at Desmond's house in Geist. Connor there, Pamela, his second wife, 2 of Desmond's sisters, Connor's cousin, Jeff, and I was not included. And I found out on the Monday before when Beth called. Beth being Connor's older sister, 44 years old, short auburn hair, high school guidance counselor, the one person in this family who will tell you a true thing straight to your face without flinching. And she said, "He didn't invite you, I know. I'm sorry. I'm going to be there and I'm going to watch." And I told her not to make it about me. And she said, "It already is about you, whether or not anyone in that room admits it." And after we hung up, I opened my laptop and pulled up the joint account. And there were 7 transactions marked christening related. The church donation, the catering deposit, the parish hall venue fee, the florist's half deposit. And every single one of them was filed under N. Tatum. And the total was $3,200. And Desmond had been organizing this event and accepting without a single question that the payments were being handled. And it had never occurred to him to ask by whom. And I printed every receipt, and I put them in a manila envelope, and I put a blue rubber band around it, and I put it in the drawer under my Q3 budget files at the office. And I did not touch it again. And then Connor called that night, and he said his father wanted to keep the christening small. And I asked what small meant, and he was quiet for 7 seconds. I counted. And he said his father thought it would be less stressful if I let Desmond handle the day. And I said, "He wants me not to come to my daughter's christening." And Connor said something about how I know how he is. And I said, "I do." And I said, "Tell him I understand." And I hung up. And I sat in our kitchen without moving for 11 minutes. And then I went to check on Lily, who was asleep, and she made a small sound when I came in. And I put my hand on her back and counted her breaths. And I thought, no. Because what Desmond Calloway did not know, what no one in that house knew, was that in 72 hours, Father Brennan's assistant was going to call my cell phone, and I was going to answer it, and I was going to ask for everything in writing, with my name on it. In the days after that phone call, Desmond Calloway did what men like Desmond Calloway do when they are afraid someone will push back. He got there first, quietly, through other people, which is the particular skill of a man who has spent decades confusing control with care. He called Connor's aunt in Fishers and told her Nora was being difficult about the christening. He told Pamela that I didn't value tradition, which landed in the family's group text as a soft bomb, the kind that makes everyone suddenly very careful about what they say around you. He told Connor's cousin Jeff, over golf, casually, the way you say things you want repeated without seeming like you're repeating them, that the christening needed to be a Calloway event, and everyone who heard that phrase understood exactly what he meant, and no one said so, because that is the other skill, making the unsayable thing the only thing everyone is thinking. I know all of this because Beth told me, not in one conversation, but in pieces, over 3 weeks of texts that arrived between her second period class and her lunch break, each one starting with, "Okay, so," and ending with a detail that would have made me cry 6 months ago, and now just made me open my laptop and pull up the account balance. I went to work. I managed payroll for 73 employees across 3 locations. I negotiated a new supply contract with a pharmaceutical vendor who had been overcharging us for canine heartworm preventatives for 2 years. I did the quarterly tax filing, which took 11 hours over 2 days and came out perfect. And I did all of this with a 4-month-old who was not sleeping more than 3-hour stretches at night. And I want you to understand that I am not telling you this to impress you. I am telling you this because this is what women do. This is what we do while we are being discussed as problems. We keep everything running. We do not let the machine stop. We show up and we do the work, and we go home and we sit in the kitchen at midnight feeding a baby, and we do not fall apart, even when every cell in our body wants to. And I knew even then that the envelope in my desk drawer was getting heavier every week, though I hadn't touched it. There was one day in early April, a Thursday, when I was driving home from the Westfield vocation, and a song came on the radio. One of those early marriage songs, the kind that hits the exact coordinates of a feeling you thought you'd put away. And I pulled into a Walgreens parking lot and sat there for 6 minutes because I couldn't see the road clearly. And I thought about calling Connor. And I thought about calling Desmond. And I thought about calling a lawyer. In that order. And then I did none of those things. I just sat there until the song ended, and then I drove home. I drafted a text to Desmond once, in late March, at 1 a.m. when Lily had been awake since midnight and I was sitting in the rocker in her room with the phone in one hand. And the thought was, I have paid for everything in this christening, including the donation your own parish needed because you never wrote the check you promised. And I want you to know that. I typed it. I read it twice. I deleted every word, not because I was afraid, because the time wasn't right, and I have been keeping records long enough to know that you don't spend the receipt until the moment matters. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, while I was between locations, and the number was a 317 area code I didn't have saved, and I almost let it go to voicemail, and I answered instead. And the woman on the line introduced herself as Father Brennan's parish assistant, and she was apologetic and warm, and she said the venue invoice for the parish hall had come due. The remaining balance was $650, and additionally, there was a verbal commitment of $500 to the discretionary parish fund that Desmond had made at a council meeting in January, and that commitment had never been submitted in writing. And could N. Tatum confirm whether she'd like to honor it or let it lapse? I said, I'll honor it. Add it to the invoice. She thanked me. I said, I'll need written receipts mailed to my home address with my full name on them. She said, of course. I gave her the address. I hung up. I paid the $1,150 online before I pulled out of the parking lot. The receipts arrived Thursday. 2 sheets of St. Augustine's parish letterhead, N. Tatum printed at the top of each, signed by the assistant, stamped with the parish seal. And I put them in the manila envelope with the other 7. And I put the rubber band back around it, and I sat at my desk at Whitmore for a few minutes, just looking at it. Because the total was now $5,050, and I was holding paper proof that every dollar of my father-in-law's event had come from my accounts. And that thought was not triumphant. It was just very, very clear. Then, 3 days before the christening, I found the voicemail I had missed because I'd had the phone on silent during a staff meeting and forgotten to check. And it was from Father Brennan himself, not the assistant Father Brennan. And his voice was warm and unhurried, the voice of a man who is entirely at peace with his place in the world. And he said, Ms. Tatum, this is Father Brennan at St. Augustine's Parish. I wanted to personally call and thank you for your generosity to our community. The Callaway christening is going to be a beautiful occasion, and your support has made it possible. We look forward to celebrating with your family on Saturday. God bless you. He said, Ms. Tatum. He said, your family. He said, made it possible. I listened to it 4 times, standing in the hallway of the Westfield location, with my back against the wall and the phone pressed hard to my ear. And on the 4th listen, I pressed save. And I stood there for another minute, thinking about how Desmond had built this entire event around his name, had coordinated and called and organized, had accepted without a single question that everything was being taken care of, and had never once thought to ask, by whom? And the woman he had decided wasn't welcome. Whose name? Whose actual name? Whose professional name that he had dismissed as evidence she wasn't a real Callaway, was the name on every check, on every receipt, on every line of Father Brennan's ledger, on the voicemail from the parish priest thanking her personally for her generosity. That night I told Beth. I didn't tell her everything. I just said, Father Brennan called me to say thank you. There was a long pause, and then Beth said, Does my father know who pays the bills? I said, He doesn't. Another pause. Does Father Brennan? He does. I could hear Beth breathing on the other end. She said, Nora. I said, I know. She said, What are you going to do? I said, I'm going to the christening. And then Saturday morning came, and I put on the navy dress, and I dry cleaned it the week before, and it still smelled like the cleaner. And I pinned my mother's pearl in my hair, and I picked up the manila envelope from the kitchen counter where I had set it the night before, and I put it in my bag, and I buckled Lily into her car seat, and I drove to St. Augustine's. And I was 14 minutes early, and I sat in the parking lot for all 14 of those minutes, just holding the steering wheel. And Lily was asleep, and the October light was doing something beautiful on the stone facade of the church. And I thought about the 9-year-old girl who mailed a check for $84 and put the receipt behind the clock. And I thought, she would understand exactly why I brought the receipts. I walked into St. Augustine's before Desmond arrived, which I did deliberately, because I have been early to every important thing in my life, and I was not going to let this one be different. And Beth was already there, in the second pew on the right in her deep green dress, and she had saved the seat beside her, and when she saw me walk in, she did not move or make a sound. She just met my eyes and nodded, which is the specific communication of a woman who has been waiting for you and is relieved and furious on your behalf in equal measure. And I sat down, and I put my bag on my lap with the envelope inside it, and I held Lily against my shoulder because she had woken up in the parking lot and was doing the particular wide-eyed looking around that babies do in high-ceilinged spaces, as though the architecture is personally interesting to them. And the church was beautiful. Candles lit along the side aisles, October sunlight coming through the stained glass and throwing colored light across the stone floor. And I sat in it quietly, and I let it be beautiful. Because whatever else this day was going to be, my daughter was going to be christened in it. And that part was real, and it was mine. And no one had paid for it more than I had. Desmond arrived 12 minutes after me. I heard the doors at the back. I did not turn around. I heard Pamela's voice, low and instructional. And then I heard Desmond's footsteps. He walks like a man who expects rooms to rearrange themselves for him. That particular heavy, certain stride. And then the footsteps stopped. And I knew without looking that he had seen me. And I stayed very still. And Beth beside me stayed very still. And I heard Connor say something low, and I heard Desmond say something lower. And then they moved to the other side of the church. And I exhaled so quietly that only Lily would have heard it. And she was looking at the stained glass. Father Brennan was in the vestibule greeting families as they arrived, and I had been watching the door from the corner of my eye, and when he came into the nave to make his way down the aisle, he saw me before he saw anyone else. Or rather, he recognized me first, because he had spoken to me twice on the phone, and I was the name in his ledger, and so in some sense I was the person he knew best in that room. And he came directly to where I was sitting, and he held out his hand, and he said, "Miss Tatum, what a blessing to finally meet you in person. Thank you for everything you've made possible today." And he said it warmly and clearly, and without any awareness of what those words were doing to the air in that room, because he was simply a man expressing genuine gratitude to the person who had funded his parish event. And that person happened to be the woman standing in the second pew who had been told she was not welcome here. I shook his hand. I said, "Thank you, Father. I'm so glad to be here." I did not look at Desmond. I did not need to. Beth's hand found mine under Lily's blanket and squeezed once. The ceremony was everything a christening should be. Candlelight and Latin and water and the priest's voice echoing off the stone. And Lily did not cry when the water touched her head. She just blinked. And I thought about my own mother, who was watching from a live stream in Terre Haute because she couldn't make the drive. And I thought, she knows my name. She has always known my name. The reception setup happened in the parish hall adjacent to the church, a long, low-ceilinged room with folding tables and good linens, and the catering setup I had paid for. And people were getting plates and finding seats, and the volume was rising in the pleasant way of family events, where everyone is briefly glad to see each other. And I was standing with Beth and Lily near the windows, when I saw Father Brennan cross the room toward the cluster of Callaways near the drinks table, and he was carrying his leather-bound parish ledger, and I recognized it from the description the assistant had given me. The brown leather, the brass clasp at the corner, and I watched him reach Desmond's side of the room, and I watched Desmond straighten up the way he does when clergy approach, that particular performance of Catholic deference, and I watched Father Brennan open the ledger, and I moved a few steps closer because I wanted to hear, and I was close enough. The administrative matter was this. A vendor had submitted a correction invoice for the catering coordination, a small line item discrepancy, and the parish needed a signature from the account holder to authorize the adjustment and close out the file. Father Brennan looked at his ledger. He said, "The account is listed under N. Tatum. Could someone point me toward N. Tatum?" Desmond said, "I don't think that's," and his voice had a particular quality I had never heard from him before. A quality I would describe as a man discovering, in public, that the floor is not where he thought it was. Pamela looked at Connor. Connor looked at me because he knew. Connor had always known. He had told me it didn't matter, and now it mattered. And then Desmond looked at me too, and I raised my hand and I said, pleasantly, "That's me, Father." Father Brennan smiled with his whole face. He came over. He opened the ledger to the page and he showed me the line item, and I said, "Yes, that's correct." And I signed. And while I was signing, he turned to the room, to Desmond and Pamela and the aunts and Connor's cousin Jeff and the half-dozen other Callaways standing in that parish hall, and he said, "Your daughter-in-law has been extraordinarily generous to this parish this year. The donation to our discretionary fund, the venue coordination, all of it. She has made this entire occasion possible. We are very grateful to you, Ms. Tatum." He said it simply, the way you thank someone for something real. He had no idea, or perhaps some idea, of the exact weight those words were carrying. Desmond made a sound that was not quite a word. His hand went to the Rolex on his wrist and adjusted the clasp. Once, and I recognized that gesture. I had seen it at every Christmas, every Easter, every Sunday dinner where something went not quite as he had planned. And then he looked at me, and it was the longest he had ever looked at me directly. And what was in his face was not rage, not embarrassment exactly, but something more complicated. The look of a man who has been given, very quietly, information that reorganizes everything he thought he knew, and who does not have the language to respond to it. I handed the ledger back to Father Brennan, and I thanked him, and I picked up Lily from Beth's arms, and I went to get a glass of water. And that was it. That was the whole thing. There was no confrontation. There was no speech I had prepared. There was just a priest with a ledger and an administrative question and a name that had been on every check for 3 years. And the person that name belonged to, raising her hand in the middle of a room she had been told she wasn't welcome in. And that was enough. That was exactly enough. Beth found me by the windows 10 minutes later, and she just stood next to me for a while without saying anything, looking out at the parking lot. And Lily was asleep against my shoulder again, and the October light was still doing the thing on the stone outside. And Beth said, eventually, very quietly, "He had no idea." I said, "No." She said, "He really thought he was the one who—" "Yes." She breathed out, "Nora." I said, "I know." We stood there for another minute, and I let myself feel what was happening in my chest, which was not victory, exactly, but something closer to the absence of a weight I had been carrying so long I had stopped noticing it was there. And I thought about Desmond, the Rolex that was his father's, the company he sold, the particular loneliness of a man who has been performing a version of himself since 2009 and has no idea the performance has been visible all along. And I did not feel contempt, and I did not feel pity. And I did not feel forgiveness yet, either. But I felt, for the first time in 3 years, that I was standing in the right place with the right name, and that it had always been my name, and it always would be. Desmond did not say anything to me directly that day, or for several weeks after, and I did not expect him to, because men like Desmond do not have the vocabulary for the kind of moment that happened in that parish hall. Not because they're unintelligent, but because they have spent so long in the position of the person who names things that they have no practice with being named. And the thing that was named in that room was not cruel or public in the way he would have understood how to respond to. It was just true, quietly and completely true. And that is harder to recover from. What happened instead was the slower, less dramatic thing. Word traveled. It travels differently in parishes and in close suburban neighborhoods than it does anywhere else. Not as gossip exactly, more like a gradual revision of the record, the way a fact settles into a community until it's just part of the landscape. By Thanksgiving, I noticed that Desmond's sister Maureen, who had been coolly polite to me for 3 years, in the way of women who are following a patriarch's cue without examining it, had started talking to me the way people talk to someone they've decided is actually there. She asked me about my work, specifically, not just how's work, but about the veterinary practice, about managing multiple locations. And she listened to the answer. And there was something in her attention that was different from before. A quality of actually hearing what I was saying. Connor's cousin Jeff sent me a text 2 weeks after the christening. Just, beautiful ceremony. Lily is great. You did a nice job organizing everything. And I stared at that text for a while, because Jeff had never texted me directly. Not once in 6 years, and I understood that the word organizing was doing some specific work in that sentence. And I wrote back, "Thank you, Jeff. She was perfect." And I left it there. Connor had a conversation with his father sometime in November. He told me about it on a Thursday evening after Lily was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea he'd made without being asked, which is his tell that he's about to say something difficult. And he told me that he'd said what he should have said months ago, which was that Nora is my wife, and this family includes her fully, or it doesn't include me fully. And I appreciated that. And I also understood that it came 3 months too late to be the thing that fixed what happened. But it came, and it was real. And Connor is not Desmond, and I have always known that.
And that has always been the complication. Desmond himself, this is the part I've thought about the most, did not apologize. I did not expect an apology. Desmond is 68 years old, and he learned a long time ago that the patriarch does not apologize. The patriarch adjusts, which is a different thing. A subtler and in some ways more costly thing, because it means carrying the knowledge of what you did without the relief of having said so. What he did instead, at Easter dinner at his house in Geist 4 months later, he looked at me when he was speaking to Connor about something unrelated, and he included me in the sentence. Not talked at me, included me, as though I was someone whose presence he had registered. And then, at the end of the night when everyone was leaving, he said, to me directly, "Nora, good to see you." Just my name, not Connor's wife. Nora. It is such a small thing. It is such an enormous thing. I drove home with Lily in the back seat and Connor in the passenger seat, and I did not say what I was feeling, because what I was feeling was too large and too quiet for the car. But I held it very carefully all the way home. That small, enormous thing. My own name out of his mouth. And I let it mean what it meant. Beth took me to lunch in December, just the 2 of us,
at a Thai place near her school that she had been recommending for 2 years. And she ordered the thing she always orders, and she looked at me across the table and she said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "You don't?" She said, "I watched him do this to you for 3 years, and I named it, but I didn't do enough, and I need to say that to you directly." I sat with that for a minute, because it was a real thing she was saying, and it deserved a real answer. And I said, "You showed up. You saved me a seat. That was enough." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "You are the most understated person I have ever met." And I said, "I know." And we both laughed. The particular laugh of women who have been holding something heavy and have just, briefly, set it down. I wrote a letter in January, not to Desmond. I have thought about writing to Desmond, and I have decided I will not, because there is nothing I need from him that a letter would give me, but to myself, which is something I have never done before, because I am a person who deals in spreadsheets and receipts and concrete records, and a letter to yourself is the most unaccountable kind of document there is, and maybe that's why I needed to write one. I wrote it at my desk at Whitmore on a Tuesday afternoon between 2 staff meetings, on a legal pad in the handwriting I use when I'm not rushing. And the letter said several things, but the thing it said that I keep coming back to was this. The question was never whether I was welcome. The question was, who was paying attention? I folded it and put it under the Q3 budget reports in my desk drawer, next to where the manila envelope used to be. And I sent a version of it to Beth that night at 11 p.m. A few sentences, not the whole thing. And she texted back 4 minutes later, "That's exactly right. Get some sleep." I got some sleep. Things are different now, in the particular way that things get different when they don't change all at once. Slowly, in small, observable ways, like light changing over the course of a morning, without you catching the exact moment it shifted. Desmond is still Desmond. He will always be Desmond. But there is a Nora-shaped space in the room now that was not there before. A space that has my name on it, and I did not fight for it, and I did not argue for it, and I did not leave a message or send an email or write a letter to anyone but myself. And it exists because a priest opened a ledger in a parish hall and asked a simple question, and the answer turned out to be the thing that answered everything. I am sitting at my desk at Whitmore Veterinary Group right now, and a patient file just crossed my desk. A 6-month-old Labrador Retriever, patient name Lily. And I smiled without planning to, because my daughter is at daycare 3 miles from here, asleep in her crib during afternoon nap, and she has no idea about any of this, and she will not for a very long time. And one day I will tell her, and when I tell her, I will tell her all of it. The gas bill behind the clock, the down payment, the receipts, the rubber band, the 7 minutes I sat in the kitchen after Connor's phone call before I went to check on her. And I will tell her, your value is not something other people grant you. It is something you have always had. And the work is not convincing them. The work is knowing it yourself so clearly that when the moment comes, all you have to do is raise your hand. My name is Nora Tatum. I am 38 years old. I am the person who paid for the room. I have always been the person who paid for the room. And now everybody knows it. If you felt something watching this, if you've been the person in a room like that one, the person who keeps everything running and still can't get a seat at the table, leave me a comment and tell me about it, because I read every single one, and I need you to know that you are not invisible, not here, not with me. Like this video if Nora's story stayed with you, subscribe so you never miss the next one, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. I'll see you in the next one.